Every Good Friday service for 2,000 years has named the wrong man. I want to begin there. Not as a provocation and not as a conclusion. I intend to defend beyond what the evidence permits. As a question, the question that a single document, buried with a monk in the Egyptian desert, forces you to confront once you have read it carefully enough. The question is this: who gave the order to kill Jesus of Nazareth? You know the answer you were given. You have known it since the first time anyone explained Good Friday to you. A Roman governor named Pontius Pilate, under political pressure from a crowd, from the temple authorities, from the accumulated weight of a situation that had moved beyond his control, washed his hands of it. Literally. The image is so familiar, it has become a phrase in ordinary language. To wash your hands of something, to disclaim responsibility, to perform innocence in public while authorizing the thing you claim not to want. But there exists a fifth document, a fifth gospel, one that was not in the Bible you were handed. And the name it gives, the name of the man who gave the order, is not Pontius Pilate. I have been carrying this document in my research for some years now, working through its implications slowly, because its implications do not resolve quickly. And what I want to do today is take you through the evidence carefully, without shortcuts. Because this particular question, he who killed Jesus, has consequences that extend far beyond the theological. It has consequences that run directly through 2,000 years of history, and through the suffering of people who died, because the answer was given as it was, rather than as this document gives it. But first I need to show you something that most people have never been invited to look at directly. I need to show you that the four Gospels you already know do not agree on this question. Not in minor ways, not in ways that can be harmonized with a little goodwill and a commentary that explains the apparent discrepancy away. They disagree in ways that, once you have seen them laid out together, are impossible to read as anything other than evidence that the narrative was being constructed, not transmitted. There is a document, a fifth testimony, and the name it contains is not the name you were given. Hold that. I first noticed the scale of the disagreement in the early years of my postgraduate work at Durham, in the north of England. It was the kind of late winter that city has, grey and cold and specific in its greyness, the light from the cathedral coming in at a low angle through the library windows in the afternoon, landing on the desk without warmth. I had come in early that morning with a simple enough project, to work through the four gospel accounts of the Passion narrative side by side, comparing their handling of the trial before Pilate. A comparative exercise, the kind of thing you do in biblical studies without expecting it to disturb you. I had a working copy of a synopsis, one of those scholarly volumes that sets the four Gospels in parallel columns so you can read the same moment of the narrative across all four traditions simultaneously. I turned to the relevant section. I had a notebook. I intended to spend the morning cataloging the variations in detail, the small differences in phrasing, the different sequencing of events that oral traditions can produce, the kind of harmless variation that good scholars acknowledge and less careful ones smooth over. What I found instead was not harmless variation. The differences in how the four canonical Gospels assign responsibility for the death of Jesus are not peripheral. They are structural. Each Gospel, written in a different decade, for a different community, with a different theological agenda, had taken the central political fact of the Passion, who bears responsibility, and handled it differently, systematically differently, in ways that are too consistent, too purposeful, to be accidental echoes of a single oral tradition. I put my pen down at some point in that morning. The light had shifted by then, moved across the desk. The tea I had brought with me was long cold. What I had in front of me was not a minor scholarly puzzle. There was evidence that the story had been told differently by four different narrators, in four different decades, in ways that served four different institutional and political purposes. Let me show you what I mean. In the Gospel of Mark, the oldest, written approximately 40 years after the death of Jesus, Pilate is a man under pressure. The chief priests stir up the crowd. The crowd demands the release of Barabbas. Pilate asks them, somewhat helplessly, what he should do with the man they call the King of the Jews. They shout back he delivers Jesus to be flogged and crucified. Mark's Pilate is not innocent precisely, but he is reactive. He is responding to forces around him that he cannot or will not resist. The initiative does not come from him. In the Gospel of Matthew, written roughly a decade after Mark, something significant has been added. Pilate's wife sends him a message during the trial. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." And then Pilate performs the gesture that has given us a phrase. He calls for a bowl of water, washes his hands before the crowd, and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." And the crowd, Matthew's crowd, responds with a sentence that would reverberate across 2,000 years of history. "His blood is on us and on our children." That sentence is not in Mark. Matthew added it. Writing in the 80s of the Common Era, decades after the events described, writing for a community that had recently experienced the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 of the Common Era, Matthew added a line in which the crowd collectively accepts responsibility, not merely for themselves, but for their descendants. The blood curse. It is almost certainly the single most consequential addition to the Passion narrative in terms of its historical consequences. Centuries of persecution of Jewish communities across Europe were justified by appeal to that one sentence. That Matthew wrote it and Mark did not have it is not a matter of scholarly controversy. In the Gospel of Luke, something else entirely happens. Pilate, after questioning Jesus, declares that he finds no basis for a charge against him. And then, and this is the moment I want you to hold, he sends Jesus to Herod Antipas, not to pronounce judgment, not to share the decision. He sends Jesus to Herod because, as the text explains, Jesus was from Galilee. Herod had jurisdiction over Galilee. Pilate is in effect saying, "This is not my problem. It belongs to him." Herod questions Jesus. Jesus says nothing. Herod mocks him, dresses him in an elegant robe, and sends him back to Pilate. And then Luke records something that most people pass over without much attention. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. The meeting between Pilate and Herod, which Luke introduces as a jurisdictional referral, ends with an improvement in diplomatic relations. Luke's Pilate ultimately declares Jesus innocent a second and then a third time, and eventually yields to the crowd's pressure. He does not himself order the crucifixion. In Luke's account, the grammar is ambiguous enough that some scholars argue it is the crowd, not Pilate, who is presented as the ultimate authority for what happens. In the Gospel of John, written last and most theologically developed, Pilate occupies more of the narrative than in any other account. He interviews Jesus at length. He questions him about kingship and truth. He goes back and forth between the crowd outside and Jesus inside. He declares his innocence multiple times. He offers to release him under the Passover custom. He presents him to the crowd with the words, "Behold the man." When the crowd presses him, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Pilate capitulates, takes his seat on the judgment seat, and delivers Jesus over to be crucified. John's Pilate is the most elaborate, the most philosophically engaged, the most explicitly exonerated of the four. John is also the gospel written furthest from the events. The correlation is not accidental. What you have across those four accounts is a trajectory. From Mark's reactive, pressured Pilate, through Matthew's explicitly hand-washing Pilate and his blood-cursed crowd, through Luke's Pilate, who tries to pass jurisdiction to Herod, to John's philosophically engaged, multiply-exonerating Pilate. What you are watching, decade by decade, is Pilate becoming more innocent and the Jewish authorities becoming more responsible, written over the course of roughly 30 years. In the context of a movement that needed the Roman Empire's tolerance to survive, by communities that had every reason to present their founding narrative in a form that did not make Rome the villain. The progression is not what happens when several people remember the same event differently. It is what happens when several communities are shaping a narrative to serve a consistent political purpose. That is the first thing I want to give you. Because without it, the document I'm about to show you looks like an isolated curiosity. With it, the document looks like something else entirely. It looks like the version they removed. What I am about to tell you is not a matter of interpretation. It is a textual fact. And if you have been following this channel for any length of time, you will know that I only say that when I mean it precisely. In 1886, a French archaeological mission working in Akhmim, a town in Upper Egypt approximately 97 kilometers from Nag Hammadi, where the great Gnostic library would be found 60 years later, was excavating a necropolis, a burial site. The tombs were Christian from the Byzantine period. The archaeologist leading the mission was Urbain Bourriant. Inside one of the tombs, buried with a monk, they found a codex, a small manuscript, 8th or 9th century in date from its physical characteristics, but preserving texts of considerably greater antiquity. And one of those texts, covering 39 verses, was a passion narrative, a fragmentary gospel. Its opening line was damaged, but the text identified itself in its final section as being written in the first person by Simon Peter. This was the Gospel of Peter, known from references in the writings of early church fathers, but believed lost, until a monk in Akhmim took it with him to his grave. The text that Bourriant's team had found was not a theological novelty or a mystical revelation. It was a passion narrative, an account of the trial, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In structure and content, it was recognizable as belonging to the same tradition as the 4 canonical Gospels. It described the same events, in roughly the same sequence, with the same central figures. But there was one difference. One structural, foundational, consequential difference. In the Gospel of Peter, it is not Pontius Pilate who gives the order of crucifixion. It is Herod Antipas. Pilate, in the Gospel of Peter, is present at the proceedings and explicitly refuses to participate. He washes his hands. The gesture Matthew puts at the center of Pilate's exoneration is in the Gospel of Peter too, but with a different import. In this text, it is not a gesture of political self-protection. It is a genuine refusal. Pilate declines to pronounce judgment. He will not condemn an innocent man. The text reads, "But of the Jews none washed their hands, neither did Herod, nor one of his judges." Herod proceeds. It is Herod who orders the body to be taken away and crucified. And then the manuscript breaks, mid-sentence, at the precise point in the narrative where the account of the resurrection morning would become most explicit about who saw what and when. The manuscript does not close. It does not conclude. The word before the break is incomplete. The next page either was never written, or was separated from the codex at some point in its long history, or was removed before burial. We do not know. The Gospel of Peter gives us Herod as the man who gave the order, and then it stops speaking. The New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, whose textual analysis of the early Christian manuscript tradition I regard as among the most rigorous produced in the last half-century, has written that the Gospel of Peter may have been composed somewhere between 45 and 150 years after the Common Era. The lower end of that range would place its composition earlier than the Gospel of Mark, earlier than any canonical gospel, not a late apocryphal invention, potentially the oldest written account of the Passion that exists. I will not tell you that Ehrman's lower estimate is certainly correct. It is the lower bound of a scholarly estimate, not a certainty. But the point is this. The scholarly range for the Gospel of Peter's composition includes the possibility, academically serious, not speculative, that it preserves a tradition older than Mark, older than any gospel in the Bible. The document they buried is not marginal. It is a competing testimony, and the name it gives is not the name that 2,000 years of Good Friday preaching have used. Now I need to ask you to think carefully about a historical question, not a theological one, a strictly historical one. If Herod Antipas ordered the death of Jesus, does that make sense? Not theologically, historically. Does the figure of Herod Antipas, as we know him from multiple historical sources, fit the profile of the man who would have made this decision? I think you need to know who Herod Antipas actually was before you answer that. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great and the Tetrarch, the regional ruler of Galilee and Perea. These were the regions where Jesus spent most of his public ministry. Jesus was Galilean. He preached in Galilean towns. He drew his early followers from Galilee. Herod Antipas ruled Galilee. Jurisdictionally, Jesus was Herod's problem before he was Pilate's, and Herod had a record. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian whose Antiquities of the Jews is one of the essential primary sources for this period, documents the execution of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who had been preaching in the region of Herod's jurisdiction, who had publicly criticized Herod's marriage to his brother's wife, who was drawing large crowds and generating a movement that could become politically destabilizing. Herod had him arrested. He had him killed, without a formal trial, without public process. It was not a judicial execution. It was a political elimination. Jesus was a more significant figure than John the Baptist by the time of his death. He had been attracting much larger crowds. He had entered Jerusalem during a major festival period, when the city's population was swollen with pilgrims, and the possibility of public disorder was at its highest. He had disrupted the operations of the temple, an institution with deep connections to both the religious establishment and the political structure of the city. He was, from the perspective of any administrator charged with maintaining order, a serious threat. Herod had eliminated threats before. He had done it quietly, without the formality of a public trial. The elimination of John the Baptist by Herod is not in dispute. It is in both the canonical Gospels and in Josephus. The precedent exists. And here is the detail in Luke's canonical Gospel, canonical, not apocryphal, that most Sunday school curricula have never found occasion to mention. Luke records that when Pilate heard that Jesus was Galilean, he sent him to Herod. Pilate recognized Herod's jurisdictional authority over a Galilean subject. He sent the man whose death we are discussing to the man whose jurisdiction covered the region where that man had been preaching, and who had already demonstrated his willingness to execute popular religious figures without trial. Luke presents this as a brief diplomatic episode that ends with Herod sending Jesus back. But the jurisdictional acknowledgement is there in the canonical text. Pilate himself recognizes that Herod has authority over this case. The historian John Dominic Crossan, in his work The Cross That Spoke, which examined the Gospel of Peter in detail, argued that this text may preserve a tradition older than the canonical account, not a later invention, but an earlier layer of the tradition that was subsequently revised. The revision in Crossan's analysis moved responsibility from Herod to Pilate. The later version, the canonical version, the version that made it into every Bible printed since the 4th century, exonerates Herod and shifts the moral weight toward the Jewish authorities and the crowds. Why would anyone want to do that? I want to give you the simple historical answer first, before I give you the one that Spinoza would have forced you toward. The simple historical answer is this: by the time the canonical Gospels were being written, Christianity was a movement that needed the Roman Empire's tolerance, not its enthusiasm, not its formal endorsement. That would come later. Simply its tolerance. A movement that wanted to operate within the Roman Empire could not afford to have at the center of its founding narrative a story in which a Roman official ordered the death of its founder. Herod Antipas was eventually removed from his position by Rome. By the time the canonical Gospels were circulating, Herod was a disgraced regional administrator from a previous generation, without political allies or ongoing relevance. Pilate himself had been recalled to Rome in 36 of the Common Era. Neither of them was a figure with any ongoing institutional presence. But Rome, the empire, the network of governors and legions and tax collectors and authorities, within whose space the early church was trying to grow, Rome was very much present. The narrative that says a Roman governor tried to save him but yielded to Jewish pressure is not just theologically resonant. It is politically useful. It turns Rome into a reluctant bystander. It locates the decisive authority for the death not in Roman administration, but in Jewish religious and popular pressure. That narrative was useful in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It was extraordinarily convenient, and the document that contradicts it, the one that says the order came from Herod, that Pilate refused, that the Roman official washed his hands in genuine refusal rather than political self-protection, that document did not make it into the Bible. Let me tell you something that happened to me in the late 1990s that I have not spoken about publicly before. I had been working for some months on an academic paper. The subject was the chronological priority of the Gospel of Peter, specifically the question of whether the text preserved evidence of a tradition that preceded the canonical Gospel of Mark. It was a careful paper. I had worked through the textual evidence methodically. I had engaged with Crossan's arguments, and with the counter-arguments. I had tried to be as conservative as the evidence permitted, framing the conclusion not as certainty, but as a scholarly possibility that deserved serious attention. The paper was not arguing that Herod killed Jesus as a historical fact. It was arguing that the Gospel of Peter might preserve an earlier tradition than the canonical Gospels, and that this possibility had significant implications for how we understand the development of the Passion narrative. I submitted it to a theological journal, a well-regarded one, the kind of journal that in those years still conducted its review process through correspondence, actual letters written and posted, with a response time measured in weeks rather than days. I sent the paper in September and received a response in December. The response was not a formal rejection. It was a letter from the editor, personally written. The specific phrase I remember, because I wrote it down, which I do not always do with rejection correspondence, was that the implications of this line of investigation make it unsuitable for our readership. Not that the argument was wrong, not that the scholarship was inadequate, not that the evidence I had cited could be challenged on factual grounds. The implications were unsuitable. I showed the letter to a colleague some weeks later. He read it twice, handed it back, and said, and he was kind about it, I want to be fair to him, he said, "Malcolm, you need to think carefully about where you want to take this professionally. This is a conversation that closes doors." He was not threatening me. He was describing a reality that he had watched operate throughout his career, and that he had, for whatever reasons, learned to navigate around rather than through. He was offering me the benefit of his experience. I sat with that conversation for a long time, not with anger specifically, with something more uncomfortable than anger, with the recognition that the mechanism I had been tracing historically, the institutional management of inconvenient evidence, was not a thing that had happened in the past and stopped happening. It was operating in the journal system of British theological academia in the 1990s. The same logic that had determined which Gospels were authoritative and which were buried in the Egyptian desert was present, still functioning, in the decisions of an editorial board about what was suitable for its readership. The boundary between what could be said and what could not be said was being policed by the same mechanism that had policed the canon. I had not expected to discover this by submitting a paper to a journal, but I had. Elaine Pagels, in her essential study of the Gnostic Gospels, documented this pattern with the care and the documentation it deserves. The pattern of exclusion she showed was not primarily theological. It was institutional. Texts were excluded not because they were demonstrably wrong on matters of fact, but because their presence complicated the narrative that the developing institutional church required. Pagels called this the politics of the canon, not with contempt, but with precision. The canon was a political document as much as a theological one. The Gospel of Peter did not fail a theological examination. The Bishop of Antioch, who initially approved it, Serapion, is on record as having seen no problem with it. Then, after what the historical record describes as more careful examination, he withdrew his approval. The historical record does not preserve what his more careful examination found, precisely. It preserves only the conclusion. This document is no longer approved. The pattern is familiar. The reasoning is not required to be explicit. The decision is the thing that matters, and the decision tends in one direction. Let me show you now what Spinoza would have done with all of this. Spinoza's method, developed in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, which he published in 1670 under cover of anonymity because he understood with perfect clarity what would happen if his name was on it. Spinoza's method begins with a question. Not, is this document true? Not, is this document orthodox? The question is, who benefits from the narrative as it is written? Who benefits from a narrative in which a Roman governor tried to release Jesus, repeatedly declared his innocence, and only yielded under overwhelming pressure from Jewish religious authorities and crowds? Not Herod Antipas. He is not even present in that version of the story. His jurisdiction, his precedent, his political motive, all of it disappears when Pilate becomes the man in the middle. The Roman Empire benefits. The story of Pilate as reluctant executioner makes Rome look at worst like a weak administrator who could not manage local politics, at best, like an innocent party dragged into a domestic religious dispute. For a movement that needed to operate within the Roman Empire, that was not a small thing. The timing is worth examining with the precision it deserves, because there is a fact here that Spinoza would have identified immediately. The formal process by which the biblical canon was established, the decisions made at the Council of Hippo in 393 of the Common Era, and at the Council of Carthage in 397, came within a single human lifetime of the Edict of Milan in 313. The Edict of Milan was the moment at which the Roman Emperor Constantine formalized the toleration of Christianity within the empire. Within 80 years of that moment, within living memory in the ancient world, the Church convened the councils that formally determined which texts were scripture and which were not. The Gospel of Peter did not make the list. The decisions that defined the canon were made at the precise historical moment when the Christian Church and the Roman Empire were in the process of becoming, politically speaking, the same thing. When the Church most needed Roman cooperation, when Roman favor was most consequential for the Church's survival and expansion, and the gospel that said Herod ordered the death, the gospel that exonerated Pilate the Roman, was excluded, formally, definitively. Elaine Pagels has documented how the pattern of exclusion in this period consistently removed texts that complicated the institutional narrative in favor of texts that supported it. Not always texts that were theologically heterodox, sometimes simply texts that were inconvenient. I'm not saying that someone sat in a council chamber in Carthage and deliberately removed the Gospel of Peter because it exonerated Rome. I am not able to make that claim. The internal deliberations of those councils are not preserved with that kind of precision. I am saying that the result of those councils produced exactly the outcome that would have been most useful for an institution dependent on Roman political favor. Whether by intention or by the accumulated weight of institutional preference, by the mechanism that Spinoza described as interpretive authority used to serve institutional need, the text that told the story differently was excluded, and the texts that told the story usefully were kept. That is what Spinoza would have said. Not that it was a conspiracy, that it was a pattern, that patterns in institutional behavior have directions, and that the direction of this particular pattern is not difficult to identify once you ask the question he taught us to ask: who benefited? Now consider this. If the Gospel of Peter is telling the truth, if it is preserving in whole or in part an older tradition in which Herod Antipas gave the order, then every Good Friday service for 2,000 years named the wrong man. Not wrong in the way that simple mistakes are wrong. Wrong in a way that had consequences. The sentence Matthew added, "His blood be on us and on our children," has been used to justify the persecution of Jewish communities across Europe for 20 centuries. Pogroms, expulsions, massacres. The theological foundation for what historians have called the longest hatred is a sentence in a gospel account that may itself be a political revision of an older tradition that told a different story. I do not say that lightly. I do not say it to shock you. I say it because the implications of this document, if its tradition is the earlier one, do not stay inside the pages of a scholarly journal. They run through history. They touch the lives of people who have nothing to do with academic arguments about chronological priority and canonical formation. If the order came from Herod, if the Roman governor refused and the regional Jewish client king gave the order, then the theological foundation for centuries of anti-Semitic violence is a narrative revision. It is a rewriting. It served a political purpose, and it produced historical consequences that have never been addressed by the institutions responsible for transmitting it. That is not something I know how to resolve in the length of a conversation. I am not sure it is something that can be resolved, but I know that not saying it is also a choice. And then the manuscript breaks, mid-sentence. In the section that would have taken the narrative through the resurrection morning, through whatever Peter claimed to have seen, or to have been told, or to have understood about what happened in the days after the crucifixion. The Gospel of Peter stopped speaking at precisely the point where the testimony would have been most consequential, where the account of what happened would have intersected most directly with the core claims of all four canonical Gospels. I have thought about this break often. I do not know whether what is missing was deliberately removed before the codex was interred with the monk. I do not know whether the manuscript was damaged in transmission before it reached Akhmim. I do not know whether the original text was simply never completed, whether the document we have is a fragment of something that was always fragmentary. I notice only this. The break occurs where it occurs, at the moment when the testimony would have been most explicit. Whether that is accident or decision, the effect is identical. We cannot know what the Gospel of Peter says next. We cannot know who the resurrected figure was claimed to be or by whom. We cannot know how the narrative would have continued after the point it reaches. We cannot know whether what follows the break would have resolved any of the questions the first 39 verses raise or deepened them. What we know is this: a text existed. It told a story that differed from the canonical account in one structural way. It named a different man as the one who gave the order. It was read in early Christian communities. It was initially approved for use in at least one community by a bishop who saw no theological problem with it. It was later disapproved without a clearly preserved theological argument. It was formally excluded from the canon. It was buried with a monk in the Egyptian desert, and it was found 2,000 years later in a tomb. The question of whether the tradition it preserves is the older one is a scholarly question. Serious scholars, not fringe voices, not conspiracy theorists, but people who have spent their careers with these documents, argue that it might be, that the narrative of Herod as the executor and Pilate as the refuser might be the earlier version, and the narrative most people know might be the political revision. I cannot tell you that is certain. I can tell you that it is possible. Academically, seriously, documentably possible. And I can tell you that the document which raises the possibility was buried for 2,000 years, excluded by councils that met during the period when the Roman Empire and the Christian Church were becoming allies, and found in a circumstance that suggests someone wanted to preserve it, even if preservation had to happen underground. The fragment breaks where it breaks. The sentence does not complete. Whatever was on the next page, whatever the monk who carried it to his grave knew that we do not, is gone. That silence is what we inherit. Not resolution, not the answer that would let you close the question and move on. The silence of a sentence that stops. I've spent a long time sitting with that silence, not with anger, not with the comfortable certainty that I know what happened, with the weight of understanding that a question was deliberately made difficult to answer, and that the difficulty has consequences that have run through 2,000 years of history, and that the man buried in a necropolis in Akhmim carried in his coffin a text that might have changed the shape of those consequences if it had been read rather than buried. That is what the document says. That is what the document does not say. And the distance between those two things is where the honest question lives. Take care of yourselves.
You know, sharing this cost me my career, my marriage, my family's respect. But I couldn't stay silent. Every time someone watches to the end, it reminds me why I keep going. Thank you.